This situation didn't just escalate, it detonated. One viral clash involving King Harris and a fan didn't just spread online. It sparked a full-blown storm around identity, pressure, and legacy. Because now it's not just about what happened in that moment. It's about a pattern nobody can ignore anymore. T.I is watching everything unfold. While King Harris stands at the center of a situation the internet is calling a breaking point. This situation didn't just escalate, it detonated. And this time it wasn't sirens, it wasn't a courtroom, and it wasn't another viral mugshot making the rounds. This time, it was personal. The kind of moment that cuts deeper than headlines ever could. Because what people are seeing now isn't just another incident, it's pressure finally breaking through the surface. Imagine building everything from nothing. Surviving environments where one mistake could cost you everything. Turning that survival into success, into a legacy, into a name the world respects. That's the story of T.I. But now, that same legacy is being tested in real time. And not by outsiders, not by rivals, but by his own son, King Harris. And just when it felt like things couldn't spiral any further, another moment hits. Another clip spreads. Another confrontation, this time with a fan. Not industry drama, not behind-the-scenes tension, just raw public conflict unfolding in front of anyone with a phone screen. And within minutes, it's everywhere. Reactions, breakdowns, opinions flooding in from every direction. But this one feels different, heavier, like something just crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Because this isn't the first time King's name has been tied to controversy. It's not even close. But this moment, it feels like a breaking point. Not just for the audience watching, but for T.I himself. People are starting to notice it, the shift, the tone, the energy, the patience that once looked controlled now starting to wear thin. And when you step back, it makes sense. This stopped being about one mistake a long time ago. It's not one incident, one argument, one viral moment. It's a pattern. A cycle that keeps repeating, each time louder, each time harder to ignore. So the real question isn't just what happened between King Harris and that fan. The real question is what that moment triggered. Because whatever went down didn't just create another headline, it sparked a reaction. And if the energy around this situation is any indication, that reaction could change everything. To really understand why this hit so hard, you have to zoom out. Because this didn't start here. This has been building for years. Quiet moments turning into public ones, small tensions turning into full-blown narratives, and at the center of it all is something much deeper than controversy. It's a disconnect. On one side you have T.I, a man who didn't just rise in hip-hop, he survived it. Real struggles, real consequences. A life where decisions carried weight most people will never fully understand. He built his name from the ground up, faced legal battles, served time, and still managed to rebuild. Not just his career, but his image, his family, his future. That kind of experience changes how you see everything, especially risk, especially consequences. On the other side, you have King Harris, raised in a completely different world. A world of access, opportunity, and visibility. A last name that opens doors before he even has to knock. But instead of stepping into that advantage, he's been pushing against it. Trying to carve out an identity that feels separate, independent, real in a way that can't be handed down. And that's where the tension begins. Because King doesn't just want to be known as T.I.'s son. He wants to be seen on his own terms. But the way he's chasing that identity, it keeps pulling him into situations that echo the very past his father fought to escape. And every time it happens, the spotlight gets brighter. The reactions get louder. And the pressure builds not just on him, but on the entire family. What makes it even more intense is how public it all is. Nothing stays behind closed doors. Every argument becomes content. Every confrontation turns into a clip. Every mistake gets replayed, analyzed, judged in real time. And that changes everything. Because once it hits social media, it stops being personal. It becomes entertainment. And when people are entertained, they stop looking for context. They just react. Most people in that position would try to move quietly, protect the image, handle things behind the scenes, but King leans into it. And that unpredictability is exactly what keeps pushing things further each time. Meanwhile, T.I. isn't just watching this as a father, he's experiencing it as a public figure. Every headline doesn't just reflect on King, it reflects on him, his parenting, his legacy, everything he's built. And that kind of pressure doesn't disappear, it stacks, especially when the same patterns keep repeating. There have already been moments where that tension spilled out publicly, arguments caught on camera, clashes over identity, over upbringing, over what's real and what's not. And every one of those moments revealed something deeper, two perspectives that just don't align. One shaped by experience, the other driven by emotion. Now add social media to that mix, and it amplifies everything. Millions of people watching, commenting, and choosing sides without ever knowing the full story, turning a family situation into a public spectacle. And once it reaches that level, it becomes almost impossible to control. Which brings everything back to this latest incident. On the surface, it might look like just another moment, another impulsive reaction, another confrontation that got out of hand. But in context, it's something else entirely. It's a signal, a pattern reaching a point where it can't be ignored anymore. A situation that's no longer just concerning, it's escalating. And for T.I., this might be the moment where patience finally hits its limit. Because there's only so many times you can try to guide someone before frustration takes over. Only so many times you can watch the same cycle repeat before something shifts. That's why this feels different. Because the real story isn't just about a fan altercation. It's about everything that led up to it. The build-up, the tension, the history. A father and son moving in opposite directions while the entire world watches in real time. The pressure has been building for a long time. Slow, steady, unavoidable. But now it's snapping. Because the second that moment happened, the phones were already out. And once it hit the internet, there was no stopping what came next. People were still recording from angles King probably never even noticed in the moment. And just like that, what could have stayed a private disagreement, something messy, emotional, human, was instantly transformed into public content. No warning, no delay, just extraction. Clip after clip started spreading. Different angles, different audio, different reactions stitched together into completely different stories. And within hours, the internet had already done what it always does best and worst at the same time. It decided. One version painted King Harris as aggressive, reckless, out of control. Another insisted the fan crossed the line first, provoked the situation, escalated it beyond reason. But here's the part nobody likes to admit. Once it hits social media, truth stops being the priority. Perception takes over. And perception doesn't wait for facts, it outruns them. And that's where this situation stops being about what happened and starts becoming about what people believe happened. Because now it's no longer a moment, it's a narrative. And that narrative moves fast. It started forming immediately. King Harris reacts first, thinks later. No pause, no de-escalation, just instant escalation. And to people who have followed him over time, it felt familiar, almost predictable. That's what makes this different from a random viral argument. It fits a pattern. Something triggers it, King responds, things escalate, clips spread, debate follows, then silence until the next cycle begins again. But this time, the context changed everything. Because this wasn't a street altercation hidden in the background of the city. This wasn't a private argument between familiar faces. This was a fan, someone from outside the industry, someone who represents the audience itself. And that detail alone shifted the meaning of everything. Because when you clash with a fan, you're not just in conflict with one person, you're in conflict with perception itself, with the public, with the people watching. And suddenly, the message forming online becomes harsher, louder, more confident. This isn't just impulsive behavior anymore. This is becoming uncontrollable. Now imagine what that looks like from the outside. A young man with a globally recognized last name, a platform most people would consider a dream. Access, visibility, opportunity already built in. A path that could open doors before he even knocks. And yet, repeatedly finding himself in situations that threaten all of it. That contradiction is what fuels everything. Because people don't just watch behavior, they try to explain it. And when they can't fully explain it, they create a story that feels complete enough to believe. And right now, that story is getting darker. While the internet spins in real time, something else is happening behind the scenes. T.I is watching. Not just this incident, but all of it. Not just the clip, but the cycle behind the clip, the repetition, the escalation, the pattern that refuses to break no matter how many times it repeats. And this is where the emotional weight starts shifting. Because T.I isn't reacting to chaos for the first time. He's lived through real consequences, real environments, real legal pressure, real moments where one decision changes your entire life trajectory. He survived that. He rebuilt from it. And that's exactly why this feels different now. Because what he's watching isn't just behavior, it's familiarity. A path he recognizes too well. A pattern he understands too deeply. And a danger he knows doesn't always announce itself before it becomes real. From his perspective, this isn't entertainment. It's escalation in slow motion. And it creates a tension. Most people watching don't fully understand the difference between watching something unfold publicly and feeling it privately. Because for him, every headline about King doesn't land as content. It lands as consequence. And that pressure builds quietly, continuously, without pause. Especially when it keeps repeating. King Harris didn't grow up the way T.I did. That's where the fracture begins. T.I.'s life was built under pressure from the ground up. Survival, mistakes, correction, consequences that came immediately and didn't leave room for fantasy. He learned the weight of decisions early, in environments where outcomes were final. King grew up in a completely different reality. One shaped by success already achieved, fame already established, protection already in place, a last name that opens doors without asking permission, a life surrounded by opportunity instead of scarcity. But instead of settling into that comfort, King has been trying to define something else entirely. Something that doesn't match the world he was born into. He doesn't just want to be known as T.I.'s son. He wants separation, identity, distance from privilege, proximity to something that feels real to him. And that pursuit is where things get complicated. Because identity built in reaction often leads to contradiction. Over time, that contradiction starts showing up publicly. Arguments, confrontations, viral moments, social media exchanges, each one adding another layer to a growing reputation. Not just as an individual incident, but as a pattern. And unlike most people in his position, he doesn't stay quiet about it. He posts it, reacts to it, engages with it, which turns every situation into fuel instead of fallout. And that changes everything. Because most people in his position rely on silence to reset perception. King does the opposite. He amplifies it. And that amplification keeps pulling attention back, again and again. Meanwhile, T.I is stuck in a different kind of pressure loop. Because every time something happens, it doesn't just reflect on King. It reflects on him. His parenting, his decisions, his legacy, and even his silence becomes commentary. He's tried different approaches over time. Private conversations, public guidance, stepping in during tense moments, trying to redirect outcomes before they escalate. But none of it fully stops the cycle. And that realization slowly changes something internally. Because there's a difference between guiding someone and watching them refuse to be guided. That's where frustration begins to shift into something heavier, something more permanent. And social media makes it worse, because nothing stays contained. Every disagreement becomes public debate. Every incident becomes analysis. Every moment becomes a narrative written by millions of people who weren't there, but feel entitled to interpret it anyway. And once that happens, the human part starts disappearing. What's left is entertainment. And entertainment demands escalation, which brings everything back to the fan incident. On the surface, it looks like another impulsive moment, another confrontation that escalated too quickly, another clip added to an already growing archive of controversy. But in context, it's not just a moment. It's a continuation, a pattern reaching visibility saturation, a cycle becoming impossible to ignore. And for T.I., this is where something shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because at some point, repeated concern stops feeling like concern and starts feeling like exhaustion. And exhaustion changes how people respond. Now, while all of this is unfolding externally, King is still operating the same way he always does. Engaging, reacting, posting, responding. Not stepping away. Not cooling down. Not allowing the moment to fade. And that alone keeps the situation alive longer than it normally would be. Because most viral incidents decay naturally. This one doesn't. It keeps feeding itself. Every response becomes another trigger. Every clip becomes another angle. Every reaction becomes another layer. And the story stops being about what happened and starts becoming about what keeps happening. At this point, the public response begins shifting. First curiosity, then commentary, then judgment, and eventually something more rigid. This isn't an incident anymore. This is who he is. And once that identity forms publicly, it becomes incredibly difficult to undo. That's the danger of perception. It doesn't wait for growth. It locks in early, and it spreads faster than correction. Meanwhile, internally, the pressure reaches a different kind of threshold. Because for T.I., this isn't a single event stacking on top of nothing. It's accumulation. Years of incidents. Years of conversations. Years of trying to guide outcomes that keep circling back to the same point. And when accumulation reaches a certain level, it stops feeling like isolated problems. It starts feeling like inevitability. And that's where the emotional weight becomes heavier than anything public reaction can fully capture. Because imagine watching someone you care about repeatedly step toward consequences you already know the cost of, but they don't fully see it yet. That disconnect is what makes this so tense. Not rebellion, not controversy. Disconnect. And disconnect is harder to fix than disagreement. Because disagreement can be debated. Disconnect just keeps widening. Now here's where the situation takes its most important turn. Because something people are beginning to notice is that this isn't just behavior anymore, it's performance. Not accidental, not passive, intentional engagement with attention itself. Every incident doesn't just happen, it continues. It expands. It becomes content. And that changes how people interpret everything that comes after it. Because now the question is, what went wrong? It becomes, is this being repeated or is this being built? And that question reframes everything. Because if it's repetition, it can be corrected. But if it's construction, it becomes identity. And identity is much harder to shift. That's why this moment feels heavier than the others. Because it's no longer about one situation. It's about direction. And direction is harder to ignore than incidents. Now the tension sits in a dangerous place. External pressure rising. Internal frustration building. Public perception locking in. And the cycle still not slowing down. At this point, there are only two possibilities left. Something interrupts the pattern, or the pattern continues until it becomes irreversible. And right now, nobody can clearly tell which one is coming next. But one thing is certain. This didn't end with that fan interaction. It started something bigger. And now everything that follows is going to matter more than anything that came before it. He's lived it. But from King's perspective, that same path doesn't look like danger. It looks like proof. Proof of independence. Proof of identity. Proof that he's not just living under a last name that came before him. And when those two worldviews collide, you don't get resolution. You get escalation. Because what we're watching now isn't just conflict, it's perspective warfare. And that's where everything starts to shift. Now here's the part nobody can really ignore anymore. As this situation kept unfolding, one question started echoing louder than everything else. Has T.I. lost control of the situation? That's the uncomfortable center of this entire moment. Not another altercation. Not another viral clip. But the growing feeling that the usual systems, guidance, discipline, influence, experience, aren't producing the outcome they used to. And that changes the tone completely. Because before, there was always a sense of control. Even when things got messy, there was a belief that it could be managed, redirected, stabilized. Now, that belief is weakening. And uncertainty is taking its place. And uncertainty is what turns tension into something heavier. Because when control feels like it's slipping, consequences start feeling closer than ever. Zoom out for a second, and it becomes even bigger than family. This is no longer private. It's public. It's viral. It's being watched, dissected, and interpreted by millions of people in real time. Every new clip doesn't just add information, it reshapes the narrative. And once a narrative starts forming, it becomes self-reinforcing. People expect chaos, so they interpret everything through chaos. And when they find it, even in small fragments, it confirms everything they already believed. That cycle is hard to break, almost impossible once it locks in. And right now, everything is feeding it. King's actions, public reactions, T.I.'s silent responses and perceived tone shifts. All of it stacking into something larger than any single moment. And that's the reality nobody can escape anymore. This isn't slowing down. It's building pressure. Every incident raises the stakes. Every reaction increases visibility. Every clip adds weight. And now the question is no longer what happened. It's what happens next. Because if this pattern continues, the direction becomes increasingly narrow. And none of the outcomes feel simple. Just when it feels like the situation has reached its peak, it takes another turn. By the time the footage finished circulating, the reaction wasn't unified, it fractured. The moment involving King Harris didn't land as one story. It split into multiple realities happening at once. Different interpretations, different justifications, different levels of blame. On one side, some people defended him. They argued fans often cross lines, provoking reactions, escalating situations, chasing viral moments without accountability. From that perspective, King wasn't the aggressor. He was reacting to disrespect. But that wasn't the dominant wave. A much louder portion of the audience saw something else entirely. Not a one-off react. But repetition, a familiar sequence playing out again. Fast escalation, public confrontation, immediate viral spread. And once that interpretation gained momentum, the conversation shifted. It stopped being about the fan and started being about pattern recognition. Who he is becoming, not just what he did. That's a dangerous shift in public perception. Because once identity enters the conversation, forgiveness gets harder. And then something else entered the mix. Fatigue. People weren't just reacting anymore, they were worn out. Worn out from repeated cycles. Worn out from predictable escalation. Worn out from situations that feel like they could have ended differently every single time. And fatigue changes everything. Because when audiences get tired, they stop asking questions. They start making assumptions. And assumptions harden into belief. At the same time, memes flooded in. Some humorous, some critical, many blending both. And once humor enters a situation like this, it changes the lifespan of the moment. It stops being temporary. It becomes replayable, reshareable, endlessly reinterpreted. And that keeps the situation alive far longer than it naturally should be. But while the public was loud, the industry response was something else entirely. Quiet, measured, careful. Because when a situation involves someone like T.I, reactions don't come freely. They come strategically. People choose distance. They choose wording carefully. They speak indirectly. You see commentary about young artists, accountability, pressure in the spotlight, statements that feel general on the surface but clearly point toward awareness underneath. That silence says just as much as loud opinions. Because in entertainment, silence often signals complexity. And complexity usually means there's more happening than what the public sees. Some industry voices leaned toward empathy. They pointed out a reality most people ignore. King Harris has never had the luxury of being unknown while making mistakes. Every moment is documented. Every reaction is recorded. Every misstep becomes permanent. That level of visibility doesn't just create pressure, it reshapes behavior. It turns reactions into performance. It turns conflict into content. And it makes private growth almost impossible. But even that empathy comes with limits. Because understanding pressure doesn't erase pattern. And that's where the conversation keeps splitting. Empathy versus accountability. Context versus consequence. Understanding versus concern. And none of those sides fully cancel the other out. Now, inevitably, the focus shifts back to T.I. Because whether he speaks or stays silent, his presence anchors the entire narrative. That's the burden of legacy. Everything tied to King reflects back on him. And the public response to that is deeply divided. Some defend him. They argue parenting doesn't end at guidance, it ends at choice. At a certain point, individuals decide for themselves. They highlight his efforts, his history of trying to intervene, his attempts to guide through experience rather than force. Others aren't convinced. They question effectiveness. They question approach. They question whether guidance has turned into distance without resolution. And those questions don't fade. They stack. With every new incident, they grow louder in the background. Meanwhile, something larger is forming outside the immediate story. A cultural conversation. Because this isn't just about one family anymore. It's about what happens when identity, fame, and pressure collide in real time under constant visibility. It's about what growing up inside legacy actually does to behavior. It's about whether exposure helps discipline or amplifies instability. And in that conversation, King Harris becomes more than a person in a clip. He becomes a case study in modern visibility. And that's where the story stops being about a single incident entirely. Because at this point, the real question isn't what happened in that moment. It's whether any moment like this can still be isolated anymore, or whether everything now is just part of a continuous unfolding story that never fully resets. And as long as that remains unclear, neither the pressure nor the narrative is going to slow down. A conversation about identity, about what it really means to grow up with privilege, but still feel the need to prove something completely different. And about how social media doesn't just watch conflict anymore, it manufactures momentum out of it. Because the moment something turns viral, it stops being just an event. It becomes a stage. And in that stage, King Harris has become a central figure, not necessarily because he's the only one going through it, but because his life is so visible, so replayed, so constantly documented, that people can't look away. And that visibility does something powerful. It stops him from being seen as just a person, and starts turning him into a symbol. For some, he essence rebellion. For others, wasted opportunity. And for many, he represents something even bigger. What happens when identity and attention collide, without a filter strong enough to contain either? Now pull it all together. A viral altercation, a divided public, an industry watching carefully, choosing words instead of sides, a father's legacy pulled into every headline, and a cultural conversation unfolding in real time. That's not just reaction. That's momentum. And momentum is dangerous. Because once a story starts moving like this, it doesn't slow down on its own. It evolves. It builds. It waits for the next moment to push it further. So the question stops being, what did people think? And becomes, what is all of this leading to? Because right now, the pressure isn't fading. It's stacking. Every clip, every comment, every reaction. Adding weight to a narrative that's getting harder to reverse. And just when it feels like everything has settled, when people have picked sides, formed opinions, and moved on, the story shifts again. Because up until this point, the focus has been external. What King did, how people reacted, how the internet judged it. But the real turning point might not be the altercation at all. It might be what happens next behind the scenes between him and T.I. Because underneath all the noise, something has already started to change. Not loudly, not publicly confirmed, but visible in pattern alone. For years, the dynamic followed a predictable cycle. King acts out. It goes viral. T.I. steps in, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, to manage the fallout. Guide, correct, contain. Then things cool down until it happens again. But this time, that cycle feels different. Because repetition eventually forces something else. A decision. Not another reaction. A decision. And that's where everything becomes more serious. Because now the question is, what will King do next? It's, what will T.I. allow next? And that changes the entire structure of the situation. Because King isn't a child anymore. He's an adult, making his own decisions, building his own identity. Whether those decisions strengthen his reputation or damage it. And that shifts responsibility in a way that can't be reversed. Because guidance only works when it's accepted. And right now, acceptance feels uncertain, which creates a tension far more complicated than any single viral moment. Now it's not just behavior. It's boundaries. It's control. It's the limit of influence between a father who sees consequences clearly and a son who is still defining what those consequences mean for himself. And nobody outside that relationship can fully predict what comes next, because there are only two paths from here. Step in again and continue the cycle, or step back and let reality take full control. And neither choice is simple. If T.I steps back, responsibility shifts completely onto King. No buffer, no intervention, no safety net, visible or invisible. But if he keeps stepping in, the pattern continues. Same escalation, same fallout, same public cycle repeating under a brighter spotlight each time. And while that internal conflict plays out, the external world keeps applying pressure. Because social media doesn't wait. It watches, it reacts, and then it demands the next chapter. Every new clip adds expectation. Every discussion adds pressure. Every opinion builds anticipation. And now people aren't just observing anymore. They're waiting. Waiting for change. Waiting for collapse. Waiting for something that finally breaks the cycle. And that anticipation is what keeps this story alive longer than the events themselves. Because the truth is simple. This isn't over. This is a turning point. A moment where everything that has happened so far is converging into something bigger, but not yet fully visible. Because patterns like this don't just stop. They evolve or they escalate. And right now, nobody can say which direction this is heading. But here's what makes it even more complicated. Even in all this tension, there is still possibility. Still potential for a different outcome. The same attention fueling controversy could be redirected. The same visibility driving criticism could be turned into growth. The same platform amplifying conflict could be used to build something entirely different. And that possibility is what makes this so unpredictable. Because it could go either way. And whichever direction it takes will define far more than just one moment. It will define everything that comes after. So the question isn't just what happened. It's what happens next. And that answer is still unfolding. Now the conversation opens up. Because this isn't a black and white situation. It's layered, uncomfortable, and deeply reflective of how identity, pressure, and fame interact in real time. So here's where it shifts to you. Do you think King Harris is simply reacting to disrespect and trying to prove himself in his own way? Or do you think this has become a pattern that's slipping further out of control? And more importantly, if you were in T.I.'s position, what would you do? Step in again and keep trying to guide the outcome? Or step back and let consequences speak for themselves? Because that decision alone changes everything moving forward. And if you've been following this story from the beginning, you already know this isn't just about one incident anymore. It's about identity. It's about pressure. And it's about what happens when the spotlight never turns off. And this story, it's still unfolding.